Just to let everyone know that most of our audience is in this room, but there are some people watching online. We've just started a streaming here, and I know for sure that there's a group in Corner Brook watching, and there may be people, who knows, so we're reaching out across the world, I guess, hypothetically. Yeah, so that's great. But I'll just briefly introduce Andrea, our speaker today. Andrea Proctor, she's a postdoctoral fellow working with us for the next year from the Department of Archaeology at Memorial. Take it away.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming. So yeah, I'm in the Department of Archaeology, but I'm actually a cultural anthropologist. And I do research related on issues related to resource management and indigeneity. And I've been learning about Labrador for the past 13 years. I grew up in Toronto, and I first came to Labrador in 2001 when I lived in Hopedale for the month of February as part of a project for the Quebec Labrador Foundation. And on my way north, I stayed in Goose Bay, and I met Keith Chalk, who now of course, is the director of the Labrador Institute. And Keith was a very gracious host, and he showed me around Northwest River and Chesney and Goose Bay. And I was very green. I was very ignorant about Labrador. I knew about the Inu's fight against the low-level flying in the 80s and 90s. And I was very interested in Aboriginal rights, so I had helped to distribute the 1999 Survival International report on the Innu back then, but that was basically my only knowledge of Labrador. So it was really amazing for me to chat with Keith and to be shown around his home and to be given this sort of personal tour, and to be welcomed with all the enthusiasm that I'm sure you all know Keith musters up, so all his enthusiasm and warmth. And it was only later that I realized, or that I heard somehow, that Keith had actually been quite vocal in his criticism about the organization that I worked for, the Quebec Labrador Foundation, and critical in the fact that it had no employees from Labrador, but instead was made up almost exclusively of people like me who were from southern Canada or from the States. And I recognized his point, absolutely, that that an organization that aims to do community-based projects and that even has Labrador in its title should have Labradorians in its midst, if not at its helm. So I completely understood. But I was also in some ways a little hurt that I was not actually welcomed with the warmth that I had experienced in my orientation tour with Keith. So the experience of suddenly being labeled as an outsider, as an imposing outsider, sort of clashed with my own image of myself, and clashed with my assumption that my good intentions would sort of clear the way. So this was my introduction to the politics of relationships in Labrador between researchers, outsiders, and Labradorians. So I very naively sort of walked into a situation where what I had been sent to do, which in this case was to set up some sort of waste management awareness program in Hopedale. Like, I just cringe when I think about it now. But what I had been sent to do just reeked of the sort of paternalistic, the history of paternalistic outsiders coming here to observe and to judge people and to tell them what to do or to somehow try to take over. So most Labradorians that I met on that trip were too nice to say anything to me. And even Keith didn't say anything to me directly, although I think maybe looking back on it now, maybe I missed something. I'm sure I was dealt with in other ways. My presence in the community was tolerated, but I probably wasn't actively included, or I probably wasn't actively sought out. So it's always a bit of a shock when you realize that people don't actually like you, or they don't actually like who you stand for. But like many people who come to Labrador, I was enthralled by this place, and I kept coming back. I guess I'm not good at taking a hint. But I just became a little more attuned to my place here as an outsider and as an outsider researcher. So as a result, much of my research has involved probably too much thinking about relationships and about this issue. So I volunteered to give a talk today for this celebration of the relationship between the Labrador Institute and communities in Labrador and Northwest River in particular, in order to talk about exactly that. Research is all about relationships. So whether it's doing community archaeology in Shesji or looking at how to use Inuit knowledge in Nunatsiavut's resource management, research always starts as a question or as a problem posed by a number of people, and then how that question gets answered relies on relationships. Relationships between experts, whether local experts or outside experts, funding agencies and communities. And there are usually all kinds of good intentions involved in research, but as we all know, there are many different types of relationships, and some of them are better than others. Some relationships are mutually fulfilling, some are rather one-sided, some are abusive, some are just frustrating. And research relationships, like all other types of relationships, are shaped by the political and historical contexts that surround them. So in the past, researchers would often come to Labrador, spend some time here, and then write books or papers about their experiences that then became the source of information about Labrador and its people. And of course, this category should not be limited just to researchers. There have been many outsiders who have, of all different descriptions, who have developed many strong interests, strong opinions about Labrador, and have become the spokespeople for interpreting the realities of Labrador. And the parallel, of course, can also be drawn to the long history of people coming to Labrador to consume something here. So whether it's resources, or a beautiful tourist destination, or a livelihood, or in the case of researchers and others, maybe a source of somehow exotic difference or an alternative way of life. And so in every case, it's a relationship based on outsiders desiring and consuming something here. And it's the kind of colonial relationship that has infuriated Labradorians for years because of the unequal control over decision-making and the unequal share of benefits resulting from this consumption. The situation, of course, is not unique to Labrador. I did my master's research in Arviat in Nunavut, and I was often told by Inuit there about an anthropologist who had spent a year with them and then written a book about them. And on reading this book, they would be very astonished to come across pictures of their relatives and very intimate descriptions of community dynamics, but with no acknowledgement of Inuit involvement in the research, and with no sense of responsibility about asking Inuit consent to publish these descriptions. So when people in Arviat told me these stories, they would often do it. They would often joke about it, and especially if I was writing my own book, writing my own notes at the time. You know, that was the time where they would raise these jokes. But the message rang out as a clear warning to me the relationship that I was hoping to build with them was already colored by their experiences with other researchers. So regardless of how I had hoped to shape my interaction with them, I was already seen in a certain light and was already colored by a certain history, and for very good reason. So as with many relationships, there's often a lot of politics and emotional baggage involved. Distrust, resentment, suspicion. So, not the best way to start a relationship, and definitely not the best way to keep a relationship going. But things are changing. Communities started to say, yes, thanks, we'll decide how and what research gets done. In some cases, we'll just do it ourselves. We can speak for ourselves just fine. And researchers and universities also realized that they were perpetuating unhealthy relationships, and they started to rethink their role in research, which is why, in many ways, why the Labrador Institute was created in the first place back in 1979 as a way to broadcast Labrador voices, perspectives, and interests. And with its roots in the MUN Extension Service, the Labrador Institute of Northern Studies, as it was initially called, saw its role in Labrador as helping to further community interests. And this often took the form of community development or training programs, documentary making, and research. And today this relationship continues, and the Labrador Institute's goal is to bring the needs and interests of Labradorians to the university and to try to get the university to try to ensure that university research and programming addresses these interests and needs. And so in doing so, the Labrador Institute is attempting to address this balance of power and to ensure that questions about control over research and questions about authority and expertise are raised. But the relationship between communities and researchers is not always straightforward, and it can be very difficult to work things out sometimes. Communities often have pressing issues that they would like to address, and if they decide to do it in this way, they have to find both the right researcher or facilitator and the funding to see the project through. The complex power dynamics within communities also makes it sometimes very difficult to reach consensus about research priorities, interests, and sharing of benefits within communities themselves. But researchers, on the other hand, often have a huge incentive to do research and to publish our findings in order to advance our careers. So we can be very enthusiastic, and some might say overly enthusiastic, to collaborate and to develop research projects. Some aspects of communities are particularly appealing for researchers as well, often because of funding agencies' preferences. Depending on the changing priorities of funders, Aboriginal communities, climate change, or economic development in northern communities, for instance, might be alluring partners or topics for researchers. So at the moment, Northwest River and other communities in Labrador have increasing numbers of suitors hopeful for research relationships. But universities and funding agencies are often also enforce a time frame that encourages very short-term projects and therefore discourages the sort of long-term getting to know you time that can often lead to greater things. So the various interests of communities, funding agencies, and researchers may not coincide, and the various levels of commitment and incentive and benefit from the research may vary. So the relationship, in other words, may be one of unrequited love and an unfulfilled expectation. So maybe time for counseling. From a researcher's perspective, this desire for dialogue and for collaboration may simply be an attempt to access funding and research opportunities that otherwise might not be available to them. You might say that some are simply playing the field. But in many other cases, this desire for collaboration is meant to address these harmful power dynamics that shaped past research. It's meant to build trust and to create relationships and to promote engagement. So, you know, we just want to be close. But does this yearning for greater engagement necessarily result in increased intimacy and a more equitable relationship? In many cases, yes, this approach is a marked improvement on how researchers launch themselves into relationships. You know, we might call it sweet talk, but at least there's some talk involved. For researchers such as anthropologists and other social scientists or health researchers who are hoping to develop a better understanding of a group of people, this desire for dialogue can also be inadvertently pushy. In anthropology, we talk about developing rapport in order to create bonds with people who would then ideally, and I was going to say reveal themselves to us, but then I thought, well, maybe I'm taking this metaphor too far. I don't want to make you have the wrong impression of what anthropologists do, but we talk about developing rapport in order to create bonds with people who will then ideally allow us into their lives. And like, yeah, it is all a bit slimy, it's true. But this desire for rapport can go a long way in you know, resulting in real conversations and real learning from each other, and it goes a long way in creating equal relationships between people. And you know, it is, after all, what we as humans do in any type of relationship. But in the research context, at its core, it is a self-interested approach that social scientists use to improve the data that they collect. So there's an aspect of this push for engagement that's simply an attempt by researchers to get better results. So either in the depth of understanding produced by the research or in gaining funding for the research. And I'm not sure that it often actually deals with the disparities in control over the idea of research itself. So if we think of research as part of the modernist project of mapping the world, of rendering it visible and accessible, we can understand research as an expression of the Enlightenment desire for coherence and control. So the eagerness for dialogue with local communities could therefore be interpreted as a desire for access for dominant groups to the thoughts, cultures, and lives of others. And as we all know, being in a relationship where you're constantly under the microscope, when you're constantly being observed and questioned, is a very uncomfortable position to be in. It's not an equitable relationship. It's not a relationship where power dynamics are honestly discussed and where both parties you know, open themselves up for analysis. The microscope is turned one way. The gaze is turned one way. So both researchers and communities deal with this challenging relationship in various ways. Some back off from certain types of research altogether. Some promote the training and the hiring of local researchers, or some simply become researchers themselves, and Keith Chalk, again, is a great example of the Labrador researcher. Some people invest the time, but some people do invest the time that is needed to develop real relationships and genuinely do try to do research that is driven by community interests. Some researchers collaborate with Labradorians in writing papers or books or making films together. Keith and I wrote a few papers together over the last few years, and the experience of trying to merge our understandings an issue was very eye-opening for me. We were discussing the land use planning process in Nunatsiavut, and Keith really challenged my criticism of the process by placing it within the local political context in which he understood it. So my position as an outsider looking in on this process was sort of tempered by Keith's very personal understanding and investment in the process, in the history of the political context. So he was situated, whereas I took more of a distant approach. And this conflict between our understandings of the same process was very productive. And again, Keith challenged me to connect the way that I understood, or that he challenged me to connect how I came to my conclusions with my position as an outsider. And I realized yet again that I need to position myself and to recognize more fully how my role here frames both my perceptions and the way that I approach research. And this is a lesson that I'm realizing is very difficult for me to learn, despite the fact that Keith and many other people have been trying to teach me this over and over again in different situations. So recently I've been trying to confront this lesson by looking more directly at how relationships affect the focus and outcomes of research itself. I've done research in the past about the cultural politics in Labrador, about how various definitions of indigeneity, or in this case Inuitness, I guess you would call it, have been constructed within the context of colonialism, and how these definitions affect people's relationships with each other within the politics of Aboriginal rights and land claims agreements. But again, my research gaze was focused on Labradorians, and this sort of single-minded focus brought with it all the problems of a one-sided relationship. By maintaining an objective and detached position as a researcher, I was avoiding taking any responsibility for my own role in the relationship, and I was avoiding turning the gaze on myself and other non-Indigenous people. So I was basically making us invisible. I was avoiding really engaging in the situation by distancing myself and in a way protecting myself from being exposed as complicit in the colonial relationships that have caused so much inequality in Labrador. So I'm currently trying to tackle this problem by rethinking my research, by acknowledging and reflecting on my position as an outsider and as a non-Indigenous woman, and by turning the research gaze around. So instead of focusing on Indigenous issues and people, I'm looking at how non-Indigenous people, and myself included, see ourselves in this relationship with Indigenous people in Labrador, and how we create narratives to understand and to deal with that relationship and with colonialism in general. So all of this involves trying to work through the difficult relationship between outsiders, researchers, and Labradorians, and to work through the issues that Keith and others presented me with on my very first trip to Labrador. So like all research, this approach involves its challenges too, and I haven't worked out my ideal role in research by any means. But I think that this struggle to honestly figure out our relationships is very worth doing. Many researchers and many people in communities are tackling the same problems, and I think we're all motivated by the same. We're all trying to improve our shared experience somehow. So in the attempt to become more engaged with each other, having good conversations about our relationships, and really questioning what we mean by engagement are very good first steps. So as Valentine's Day is around the corner, here's to all our attempts to create and maintain healthy relationships. Cheers. Thank you. If there are any comments or questions beside from